So welcome back, everyone, for the last session. This is a session on poverty, inequality, and gender issues. My name is Robert Sparrow. I'm from Wageningen University, and I have the pleasure to introduce the speakers to you. So we have two presentations, three speakers. Janneke Pieters from Wageningen University will give us the last talk of the day, but we'll start off with a presentation on anti-globalisation, poverty, and inequality. And I think it will be Peter first. So we'll have Peter Warr, Professor of Agricultural Economics here at the ANU. And he will kick off the first talk, and then he'll be followed by Arief Yusuf, who is the Executive Director of the Center of Sustainable Development Goal Studies at Padjadjaran University, which I believe is a new institute established a year ago. So without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert, and good afternoon, everyone. The Asian financial crisis, 1997 to, let's say, 1999, was a turning point for several countries in Southeast Asia, both in politics and in economics, and this was true especially for Indonesia, not only Indonesia. Now, in this presentation, we're going to focus on the story, the long-term story of poverty reduction and inequality in Indonesia, of course. Now, do we have the first slide? No. What's going to happen is that I'll talk first, and then Arief will take over and present the more challenging parts of our material. But we were worried that we would get to the end of our time, and Robert, being very bossy, would cut us off and we wouldn't be able to get to our conclusions. So we're going to experiment with presenting the conclusions at the beginning. If you find the conclusions disappointing, I suppose you might as well leave, because that's it, we can't change them at that point. Okay, so over the 20 years prior to the Asian financial crisis, 1976 to 1996, the rate at which poverty incidence declined in Indonesia was 1.44%. A fantastic achievement for any country, anywhere. A fantastic achievement in long-term historical context. After the crisis, let's say from the year 2000 until 2015, the annual rate of reduction of poverty incidence was 0.53%. Now, I think I need to explain what these numbers mean. If poverty incidence comes down from 40% of the population to, what would it be, 38.56%, in 1 year, that's a 1.44% reduction in 1 year. That's what I mean by 1.44%. So after the crisis, the annual rate of poverty reduction was 37% of the pre-crisis rate. The rate of poverty reduction slowed down a lot. And, well, you might say, okay, but wasn't the rate of economic growth slower after the crisis than it was before? Yes, it was. It was 89% of the pre-crisis rate of economic growth. The slowdown in poverty reduction was much bigger than the slowdown in growth. How come? What happened to cause that? Well, it's almost the same thing to say that after the crisis, from 2000 onwards, the level of economic inequality increased. The reason that's almost the same thing is that prior to the crisis, economic inequality hardly changed as measured by the Gini coefficient of expenditures per person. All this information derived from the Susanas survey. These two things, slow down in the rate of poverty reduction and increase in inequality, are two ways of looking at the same phenomenon. And if that's not obvious, think of this little homey example. We have a pie that's increasing at an annual rate of 5%. Situation one, the shares that the various members of the family get of the pie stays the same over time. Then, for any member of the family or any segment of the population, the rate at which the amount of pie that they get rises over time is 5%. But situation two, if the pie is increasing at that same 5% per year, but the share, let's say, of the poorest group of the population is declining over time, and therefore the share of richer groups is increasing over time, then the rate of poverty reduction would be lower than it was in the first instance because the amount of pie that the poor are getting increases more slowly. It might rise more slowly than 5%, it might decline absolutely, depending on how fast inequality rises compared with the rate of economic growth. So these two things are completely linked. Now, this piece of work that we're going to present here is part of a larger project that Arief and I are trying to do, fairly ambitious, I suppose. We're trying to explain why inequality increased. That is, why poverty reduction slowed down. And we have many candidate explanations. Well, we looked at the American literature on increasing inequality in the United States, and the first thing the American economists thought of was trade policy. So that's the first thing we're going to look at too, because it is the case that since the year 2000, there's been a retreat from globalisation. Globalisation reversal, anti-globalisation, those words all refer to this. That retreat from globalisation has occurred at the global level and within Indonesia. So in this study, we try to figure out what that retreat from globalisation, both at the world level and within Indonesia, what that has done to poverty reduction and rising inequality. To what extent does anti-globalisation, increased protectionism, same thing, global level within Indonesia, to what extent do they explain the facts that I've just put to you? And here's the answer. First, little reminder that prior to the crisis, the rate of poverty reduction per year was 1.44%, and after it was 0.53, so there's a poverty slowdown of 0.91 percentage points per year. Per year, that's almost 1% of the population not moving out of poverty now, who, if the previous rate of poverty reduction had been sustained, would have. So even though 0.53% per year is a lot better than nothing, it's not like 1.44. Well, what's our answer? Arief's going to tell you what our answer is based on, but I'm just going to tell you the qualitative nature of that answer. We estimate that increased protectionism at the global level may have reduced the annual rate of poverty reduction within Indonesia by 0.18%. I can't even see that thing clearly enough to point to anything, so I forget this. 0.18%. That is 2% of the poverty reduction slowdown. 2% of it is explained by global protectionism using World Trade Organization data. What about increased protection within Indonesia? How much does that explain? Even less. 0.1 percentage points per year, a bit over 1% of the slowdown is explained by increased protectionism within Indonesia. So even though increased protectionism, world level, within Indonesia, both contributed to a slowdown in poverty reduction and to a tiny extent increase in inequality, in spite of that, the effects are not nearly big enough to explain the massive slowdown that's occurred. I won't be offended if anyone leaves at this point. A bit disappointing. You know, we'd love to have a big answer there, but truth has to prevail. Right, so now I'm going to present some of the numbers that, the background numbers, and then Arief is going to present the methodology by which we arrived at those answers that I've just summarised. So that first panel on the left is poverty incidence. Now, if anyone doesn't know what poverty incidence means, it means the percentage of the population who've been in households whose expenditures per person fall below the poverty line, which, for the purpose of these calculations, is held constant in real purchasing power over time. So don't think of money, think of stuff that you can buy. That's what the poverty line means. It's a quantity of stuff. And poverty incidence declined both in rural areas and in urban areas, 1.44%. That was that 2-decade period ending in 1996. And then you can see from the graph that the rate of slowdown after, say, the year 2000 has been a lot slower. And now the real, 1 minute to go. The really dramatic diagram is this one on inequality. The Gini coefficient of inequality has increased from 0.30 to 0.41, 2000 to 2015. The largest increase in measured inequality of any country that we know of for any period. The fastest increase in inequality that we are aware of. If anyone knows of a faster one, please let us know, but that's according to us. Okay, 1 minute to go. So the ratio of, at the global level, the ratio of trade to GDP stayed fairly constant until 2008, after which it declined. But in Indonesia, it has declined steadily and rapidly from the end of the Asian crisis onwards, 2000 onwards. And within the global economy, protectionism has increased a lot. This is the left-hand panel, a lot since the year 2008. And that increase is particular in Indonesia. Here, this diagram on the right panel compares Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. The increased protectionism in Indonesia is much larger. And now the reason we take 2008 to 2015 is there's a marvellous paper by Stephen Marks in the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies that quantifies all this, and it shows that within Indonesia, protection went up for food, livestock, and in a negative sense, export taxation went up for minerals. I'll stop right there. Arief's going to analyse the implication of all that.
Thank you, Peter. I've been warned that the challenge of explaining this economic method to multidisciplinary audience is a bit great. But I said that, no, it's not that difficult. The most difficult part is to say it in English for Sundanese people like me. Anyway, okay, so the effect of protectionism on poverty and inequality work through one variable, which is income distributions. So the effect of this protectionism on income distribution coming from two different directions. The first is how it affects prices of commodities that people pay. And the second one from the other direction is how it affects prices of the factor of production that people supply, like labor, capital, and land. So it's two different directions. So then the prices of these commodities and factor of production in a market economy like Indonesia is determined in the marketplaces. And there are so many markets in Indonesia, hundreds of them, thousands of them maybe if you are very detailed. So the effect of protectionism working through these many markets, it will be difficult to follow by simply common sense or human intuition alone. It's difficult, it's complex. So that's why we need help. And we use model, economists use model to do that. So that's how we do it, using economic modeling approach because of limitations of our ability to understand these complexities. And the model that we use, this is an advertisement. So we capture all these two different directions, two effects in one single go. There are many other models who are only use one or two, but we use both. So the scenario, so we simulate the scenarios using these models. We use two different scenarios. The first scenario is the world's globalization reversal. So we borrow simulation from other works of the World Bank where Pieters was involved, and then use the simulation of this world rising protectionisms and apply it to Indonesian model which catch this distributional implication. The second scenario is we use the Stephen Marks paper of the number of the rising protectionism for many commodities in Indonesia and try to see the impact of on distributions. But for the second scenarios, we focus on the fourth main protectionism that rising in Indonesia in terms of the product, which is food crops, livestock, manufactured food. That's from the net import side. And also the other export side is mineral export, so two. So we will separate the two and then see how it affects. So okay, it's the first result for the first scenarios where we see the impact of world globalizations. But before I explain, I want to do a little bit, a bit more explanation to explain what it means. Okay, so let's see the first part. Let's see the first part of the pictures. So in the model, we group populations of Indonesia into 200 groups. 100 is urban populations, the other 100 is rural populations. Okay? And then for each of the 100 of the urban populations, we divide again into 100 groups. So 100 means this from the poorest 1% in terms of the income, and then to the richest 1%. So this is the poorest 1%, this is the richest 1% in urban areas, and this is poorest 1% in rural areas, and this is richest 1% in rural area. The vertical axis measures the real expenditure per person. So it is real, so this is the welfare effect. So so we can see the distributions here. So let's see, for example, the effect of the scenarios 1. So as you can see here, the increase in world's globalization reversals actually hurt rural people more than the urban people. Well, this is negative. It means hurt, harms them. Okay, expenditure per capita, but harm rural people more than urban. If you want to see how within the rural, then you can see, for example, rural poor is affected more than the rural rich here as well, a little bit. But you have to also be aware with the magnitude. And then the reason why this happened is also can be related to what happened to the income that they receive from the ownerships of the factor of production, for the ownership of labor, for the ownership of capital, land, and so on. So as you can see here, for example, that the globalization reversal at the world level harm agricultural worker and unskilled worker, capital and land, but benefit skilled labor. And another reason why this happened like this is actually the effect of the globalization that worked to Indonesian economy work through how it affects commodities output of commodities. So we see that actually the globalization reversal affect commodities, harm many Indonesian agriculture-based export, which actually really depend on much on rural areas and laborers. So that's among other explanation of what happened. So that's the first scenarios. Now the second scenarios, how Indonesia's own globalization reversal affects Indonesian economy. So first, I would like to see the impact on how it affects the income received by the ownership. This is also the distributional impact, but in economics we call it factorial income distributions. So the result between food import and mineral export, and this is combined, is actually mixed. So there is variations. The import of the protectionism in imported product of food, which happened throughout 2008 to 2015, actually benefit agricultural labor, but harm the rest, most of the rest of the factor of production. On the other hand, the rising protectionism in mineral export sectors harm, benefit only unskilled formal labor, but hurt others, factor of production, in particular the owner of land and capital, which makes sense, yeah? Because the extractive sector is very land and capital intensive sector. So you may guess what happened to the income distribution between income group will be very difficult to detect, because there is a mixed result in the impact on return on factor of production. But let's try to see the impact. How long do I have? 1 minute. Okay. Okay. So this is the effect of Indonesia's rising protectionism in food sector. Now I divide into 3 effects. The first is the income effect, how it receives income, the distribution effect, and then price effect, how the price of commodity affect the distribution of income or the consumption, and then the total effect is the additions of the two. So as you can see from here that the rising protectionism increased income in urban and rural area, particularly in urban rural areas. Here, urban rural areas. However, the effect of the price generated from this protectionism on commodities price is higher than the effect of income. So you see, higher, and also regressively distributed. So the price of the stuffs that the rural poor buy is heavily more affected by the price of stuff that the rich buy. So because of the price effect is higher than the income effect, then the net effect is negative. For all group of distribution except this 5% of the urban riches, which we assume where all this rent from the quantitative trade system will be, will be given to or will be received by. So then you can see what is the effect on inequality. Well, it's negative. Yeah, it's harmful for the welfare of most of the Indonesian people. But if you see the magnitude, actually it's not that much. And here is the effect of rising protectionism in export or mineral product. As you can see, the income, the most heavily affected in terms of income is the rich urban area, because they are assumed to be not assumed, the data suggests that it's the owner of the capital and land that use most intensively in the extractive sector. And this is the price effect, and the total effect was strongly affected by the income effect. And again, it's negative, but small. So that's what we have so far. This is the total effect. The total effect was dominated by the first scenarios. So in terms of number, this is the last slide, Robert. So as Peter said, this is the number. The impact of the poverty and inequality of this all simulation. So it, for example, it increased poverty by this much, all of the simulation, and then it increased Gini, but the Gini increase is not really visible here. But I want to insist a little bit more. But if we use other measures, there are other measures of inequality. For example, decile dispersion, the 10% top 10% to bottom 10%, or even Palma ratio, the top 10% to 40%, then you can see at least visibility, a little bit tendency to increase inequality by this much, for example. So this is the result. So let's discuss. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter and Arief.
Yeah, sure.
The next speaker is Janneke Pieters from Wageningen University. She's an assistant professor in development economics there. She will follow up with an analysis that looks at similar questions as Arief and Peter just did, but focusing more on labor markets and gender outcomes.
All right, so I think I'm the last thing between you and dinner. I should confess that earlier this week I spent my first 2 days ever in Indonesia, and it's really my co-authors Robert and Christina who are the Indonesia experts, and we joined forces to study gender issues of trade liberalization in Indonesia, so me being the gender expert, we're all economists. So in a way it would be more appropriate for Robert to give this talk, but then this was, of course, for me an opportunity to single-handedly close the gender gap in speakers. And I calculated that it's that I can account for a decline of 8 percentage points in today's speakers' gender gap. And I don't think my research will ever have more impact than that. So the research that we've done for this update is related to a broader agenda that we have because we're interested in gender gaps globally, especially in developing countries, in labor market outcomes. So that involves gaps in wages, but also in participation, so the percentage of working age population that work, sorry. Oh, okay. So globally what we see is that in many developing countries, gender gaps are closing. But there's also certainly developing countries and emerging economies where gender gaps have not been closing, including Indonesia, but also, for example, India. And so one of the reasons we want to look at trade reforms is because we want to understand better under what circumstances growth will lead to closing of gender gaps, and also what types of growth and what types of structural change. So in this talk, in the first part, I'm going to focus on the analysis that we did for trade liberalization in Indonesia during the 1990s. And then we've also looked at more recent trends, and that's going to be more the focus of the second part of the talk. So in the 1990s, this is what I mean by a sort of a stagnation in the gender gap. So what I plotted here is in blue the percentage of the male working age population currently employed, and in red the percentage of the female working age population employed. And you can see there's a gap of over 30 percentage points. So about half of working age women are employed compared to almost 90% or a little more than 80% of men. And I should say, and I'll focus on that more in the second half of the talk, but after 2003 we do see a bit of an increase in female labor force participation. So there's not only a big difference in terms of aggregate participation rates, but also in terms of the sectors, the industries where women work and the industries where men work. And so what I've listed here are a few of the sort of bottom female-dominated sectors and a few at the top, including all sectors in the economy, so also services. So at the bottom we can see things such as construction, utilities, and also, of course, the mineral sector, so coal fuels and mining is a little bit higher, with about 18% of workers in that sector being female. And all the way at the top we see sectors where more than half of the workers within that industry are female. So health and social work is right up there with almost 58% of workers female in that sector. The patterns we see in Indonesia are very typical for many, many countries. So we tend to see very similar rankings of industries, with women traditionally everywhere dominating, for example, food production and textiles and apparel. So I think those are well-known manufacturing industries employing relatively many women. So why do we think looking at trade is interesting, and why would we expect that trade might affect gender gaps in labor market outcomes? There's different potential channels, and of course the impacts would depend on why we see gender gaps in the first place. One channel is that with trade liberalization you tend to see increased competition, and that might reduce the forces of discrimination in the labor market. We don't see it plays much of a role in Indonesia, so I'm not going to go much more into that. But there's evidence for the US in the 1980s and for Brazil in the 1990s that this did play a role in reducing wage inequality. Technological change is also a channel because with intensified competition, but also with domestic firms getting better access to foreign technologies and to foreign markets for exporting, they have an incentive to upgrade their technologies to increase their productivity. And there's cases in which you can think that new technologies have different impacts on female workers compared to male workers. For example, if new technologies replace the most physically demanding tasks that used to be done by workers, the tasks that remain to be done by workers are sort of more equally accessible for women compared to men. Whereas the more physically demanding tasks, that's really where men used to have a comparative advantage. So there's some evidence from Mexico in the 1990s that better access to the US market through the North American Free Trade Agreement helped women enter male-dominated manufacturing jobs. Finally, there's the point of sectoral reallocation. So classic trade theory would suggest that with trade liberalization, some industries will manage to expand. So some industries are competitive internationally and they will benefit from liberalization, whereas other industries will decline. And so this is related to the previous slide where I showed you that industries differ a lot in terms of the share of employment that is accounted for by females. So if a sector like the textile sector is internationally competitive and manages to expand, this will benefit female workers more than an expansion of, for example, mining. And this will come back when I talk about the more recent trends. So when we analyze trade reforms in the 1990s from a gendered perspective, we already knew some of the non-gendered impacts, let's say, from previous research. So that evidence pointed out that trade liberalization in the 1990s, so that's the reduction of import tariffs mainly, led to lower child labor, lower poverty, increased employment and wages. So that's some of the results that Robert and Christina found in their earlier work. It also reduced wage inequality in the manufacturing sector, so specifically the wage gap between high-skilled and low-skilled workers. And it increased productivity in the manufacturing sector. And all of those results were really driven by the fact that firms had access to cheaper imported inputs. So by reducing import tariffs, goods from abroad become cheaper, and that means there's more competition on output markets, but it also means that firms have better access to imported intermediates, so they can benefit from that, and that's really what drove these impacts. Now, if we look at the gendered impacts, we've focused on the work participation rates, so basically the graph that I showed you in the beginning. And we found that trade liberalization in the 1990s basically had no impact on men. So we don't see any changes in terms of men's labor force participation or work hours, which might partly be because already all of the men were working, right? But there's also some other things going on. What we see is that female work participation did increase as a result of trade liberalization. And this was particularly so for the less educated women, so those with primary and junior secondary education, and for the women in the age groups 20 to 39. So associated with that increase in female work participation, we see a reduction in the percentage of women in those groups who report to be primarily engaged in domestic duties. So it seems really to be a shift from specializing in domestic duties to doing market work. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we then also find that trade liberalization is associated to lower marriage rates for women in the age group 20 to 29 and men in the age group 30 to 39. We don't find impacts on marriage rates for older age groups, suggesting that there's somewhat of a delay in marriage. So in the end, we still find marriage rates of close to 100%. So trade liberalization seems to have created employment opportunities for women, especially the medium and lower skilled women in the sort of the 20 to 39 age group. Of course, we would like to know exactly what were the channels. So why was this the case? We do see that it's, again, entirely related to the fact that import prices declined, so the benefits of cheaper intermediate inputs. It's not related to the increased competition on the output market, so we think it's not related to discrimination. There's two things going on, however, that point a bit towards potential channels. One is that we see employment growth, particularly in the more female-intensive sectors, which is related to the fact that those sectors benefited most from cheaper imported intermediate inputs, which you can see in this plot where on the vertical axis we measure the extent to which intermediate inputs in a particular sector became cheaper. So the import tariffs on their intermediates declined. And on the horizontal axis, we measured the female share of workers in that sector at the onset of liberalization. So what you can see very clearly is that, for example, the textiles and apparel sector benefited a lot from their intermediate inputs facing lower tariffs, and that's also the most female-intensive sector in her data. Whereas a sector like basic metals that employs less than 10% women benefited much less from the reduction in input tariffs. Finally, we also see something else going on within sectors because we see a reduction in sectoral segregation related to trade liberalization, meaning that women managed to enter industries that were traditionally more male-dominated. And that could be related to the type of technological change I mentioned before, but it's very hard to find direct evidence for that. So it's more suggestive evidence that something is going on also within sectors that they're managing to attract more women. Now, if we look at female labor since 1999, we see a slight increase in participation rates, particularly after 2003. So there's somewhat of a closing of the gender gap, although it's not very substantial. Male participation has remained constant again throughout the period until 2011. If we look at the distribution of female workers across sectors, first of all, it's clear that most women are in agriculture and services. So manufacturing, which is the pink bar right in the middle, accounts for only about 8% of female workers. It also doesn't account for a very high share of male workers. The other thing clear from this picture is that the services sector really accounts for most of the increase in female labor force participation during this period. Now, we've tried to look a bit at the links between trade and female labor in this period. So we haven't really analyzed particular policy impacts, and I'll come back to that later. But we've tried to look for, here in the first instance, at the composition of trade and how that's reflecting the extent to which trade requires female labor. So the first two bars here is the female intensity of exports in 2000 and 2010, where the decline that you see over time basically means that Indonesia's export basket in terms of value has shifted towards the more male-dominated industries. And that's really the story of the mining boom, right? The mineral exports boom during this period. We see a similar pattern if we look at the import side. So also if you look at all the intermediate inputs that have been imported into the country or all the final goods that have been imported, a larger share of that basket is accounted for by the more male-dominated industries. So whereas in the 1990s we saw some structural change towards the more female-dominated industries, it seems to be the opposite case in the following decade. And here's a plot where I show the value growth of exports between 2000 and 2010 on the vertical axis, where on the horizontal axis we have the female share of workers within a sector in 2000. And all the way on the right, you have the textiles and apparel sector, with almost 60% of workers being female, but very low export growth in terms of value. And the highest growers were the mining sector and also the transport equipment sectors. Finally, we asked what happened within industries. So we first looked at the composition of trades, and we saw that there was a shift towards the more male-dominated industries if we look at trade. Then we wanted to look at what's happening within industries. So on average, we see that the female intensity of industries has increased, obviously, because female participation rates have increased, whereas male participation rates did not. But then we look at three measures of trade openness at the sector level. The first is the export to output ratio, So the percentage of exports over the total output in a particular industry. And we see that this has declined quite a bit from about 26% in 2000 to 18% in 2010. So there's really been a reduction in sort of trade openness from the export side, and similar patterns on the import side. So sectors are relying less and less on imported inputs as a share of total inputs. And also we see less import penetration, which is measured as the share of imports of final goods over total domestic demand. So this picture really tells us that the economy is closing. So the average across sectors is one of sectors closing to international trade, whereas female intensity of sectors has increased. And so finally, we look a bit at the relationship between the two, where here you see on the vertical axis in the left panel, the change in female work share between 2000 and 2010. So that's within industry, how much did the percentage of women increase? And on the horizontal axis, the change in the export share of output over that period. And in the right panel, on the horizontal axis, we have the change in import penetration over that period. And you see a negative relationship, meaning that the female intensity of a sector increased more in those sectors that became less open over time. So again, this looks quite different from the 1990s period, where we saw that women were actually entering some of the male-dominated sectors because of trade liberalization. And here we don't really see a link between the sectors that women are entering and the trade that these sectors are doing. So the recent trade patterns don't really suggest improved employment opportunities for women, despite the aggregate trends looking better. So you could wonder whether this was a missed opportunity, and of course, trade policy, that's one of the messages in our research. Trade policy could be used to help achieve labor market goals. And even if it's not used for that, it should be realized that it has labor market implications, including gender inequality implications. And so what the Canadians call a progressive trade agenda could be really useful to sort of help target distributional impacts on labor markets. So some questions that we would like to tackle in further research are, first of all, with low tariffs after the major reforms in the 1990s, what are the major trade policies for Indonesia that actually affect the patterns of trade that we see? And we've already heard some of them, and basically it's going to be much more about non-tariff barriers, which are hard to quantify, but I think it's worth pursuing. And then, of course, how does that trade policy currently affect female labor, and what drives the segregation of male and female workers in Indonesia? Thank you.
Thank you, Janneke. So we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. I'll take them in groups of 3, as before. So please raise your hand, and we have a question in the back there. Who do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. My question is to Janneke. You mentioned about female and male participation, but you haven't mentioned about wage between female and male, and what is happening with that wage during the trade liberalization.
In the back, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, to Pak Arief and Pak Peter. It's a bit outside of your research, but to connect with our discussion from the morning, some scholars suggest that we can linkage the recent increasing in populism to the increasing in inequality, be it in Indonesia or elsewhere in the world. The feeling of resentment and insecurity that take form of populism. I wonder if this also can reveal somewhere in your research. There is a relationship between the rising inequality in Indonesia in the recent increasing in populism, even though the form maybe took a common denominator like religion. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for your research and your presentations today. I'm curious how you reconcile the positive impacts of open trade policies on women in one category and low-skilled workers in the other, with the hostility that was identified in some of the earlier research. The public attitude seemed to be out of alignment with the sort of data that you've discovered.
You want to start, Janneke, with the Buddhist question?
So we haven't looked at wages, and one of the reasons is that it's difficult to get reliable measures of earnings, especially in the informal sector. So by looking at participation, we're able to include everybody that's engaged in economic activity, including many workers in the informal sector particularly. So to be honest, I don't know what's been going on in terms of the wage gap.
About populism and inequality, I think the answer may be yes or no. The yes is because I'm sure that there are two different dimensions of inequality. One is the vertical inequality, which is inequality between income group, the one that we use in this paper. I think this one doesn't have anything much to do with the populism in Indonesia, but there are other dimensions of inequality, which is called horizontal inequality, which is inequality between ethnic group and female, male, and I think that may have thing to do with increasing populism. So if you have divergence in horizontal inequality between ethnic Chinese and non-Chinese, for example, that will easily create populism in Indonesia. Yeah, but that's the yes answer. But the no answer is, I try to, because inequality has been well discussed in public policy debate in Indonesia, I asked several times to several politicians, including those in offices, and I said, why don't you sell this as inequality? Sell as political sales. I said that no, it doesn't sell. Like, the identity sells a lot, but not inequality. I said, why? For no reason. And I just remember that there are some survey recently in Indonesia. Actually, Indonesian itself doesn't really understand the magnitude of this inequality, because there are some other survey, they say that the perception of inequality subjective is felt a lot less than what actually happened. So maybe they don't really understand what's not really in the magnitude that the data observe. So I think that's my answer to that.
May I throw in something here? I think it's an excellent question, very important for all of our societies. And my guess is that there's a misperception on the part of all of us about the effects of trade liberalisation. We're very conscious of it when trade liberalisation costs us our job. But we're not conscious of it when trade liberalisation reduces the prices of the stuff we buy from Magnet Mart. The hammers and the saws and so on, all made in China, very cheap. We don't realise the extent to which that is due to trade liberalisation. We're conscious when we're hurt by trade policy on the income side, but we're not conscious of the benefit from trade liberalisation on the price side, on the expenditure side. And remember, in those diagrams that Arief showed, the price effects tend to dominate the income effects for all economic categories, but we don't see it that way. We misperceive the effects. We're more conscious of the income effects than the price effects. So we get it wrong. Not the only area in which we misperceive what's happening, but I think this is one, but I think it's a great question.
Yeah, so the question about the positive impacts, but then at the same time the hostility, I would pass this to Robert, actually, who knows more about the context than I do.
Well, I've just follow up with Peter. It's not just price effects that people do not understand or see, but in the case of our study, it was also that trade liberalisation in the 90s at least led to increased competitiveness of firms as inputs became cheaper, and it led to job growth. And what we saw in our case, especially for women. And that's also not something that's obviously observed. Yeah. Okay, I can take 3 more questions. One here, yeah.
Thank you.
You have a microphone? And Wells?
Thank you very much. Not so much a question, but just to answer Peter's question from earlier. I think that the world record for increases in Gini coefficients, according to the now passed away Tony Atkinson, was the breakup of the Soviet Union, where the Gini coefficient rose from 24% to 48% over the course of a decade.
Thank
And then the only other observation is that, of course, China is a counterexample to the observation that increases in inequality always come with reduction, always come with increases in poverty as well, or slowdowns in poverty reduction. China's income inequality rose from 32% Gini to 45%, while at the same time, its poverty rate fell from 70% to under 12% over the course of a quarter of a century.
Yes, Danny, that's right. But the growth was so rapid that if inequality had not increased, poverty would have declined even faster.
Absolutely. There's a triangle of these things, and it depends on what happens to aggregate growth.
Okay. Is there a question for Ross?
Thanks. My question is for Janneke. In your presentation, you had a lot of charts. And, well, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but there was one chart which stuck out for me, which was towards the end, and that was the one that showed the change in the female labour force participation rate. And you said that it had gone up, but it had gone up by only a tiny little bit. So it seemed to me that all the other work that you did there, or you and your colleagues did there, it sort of comes to nothing in a sense. It tells me that whatever trade policy was going on during that period, really there was very, very little change in the female labour force participation rate. And to me, I'm not particularly interesting. I don't find it particularly interesting to say, well, the number of women in this industry went up, but the number of women in that industry went down. To me, it's the total that matters. And so, have you really found anything that's of fundamental interest that I should get excited about?
Sorry, I couldn't get you excited with my graphs. So the 1990s period, where there wasn't even a tiny increase in female labor force participation, is where we see the positive impacts of trade. And so I think the story is, despite those effects, participation didn't increase. So we will absolutely not claim that trade liberalization accounts for anything we saw on aggregate in that period. But what we want to figure out from this research is sort of what types of growth help and what are the channels through which trade would affect women. And I think that's important to know, even if it can't explain the aggregate trends that we observe.
I can take one more question. I saw a hand go up there, or you were just waving? Okay. Okay, in that case, if there are no more questions, I have two things I want to do. One is I would like you to join me in thanking the speakers.